Okay, hello again to my friends, family, and audience around the world. Today I'm privileged once again to have as my guest for my podcast and YouTube channel, Dr. Subhash Kak. His reputation precedes himself. He is the recipient of the Padma Shri in 2019. He is a part of the India Prime Minister Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisory Council. He's an author of over 30 books on a number of topics from history revisionism, quantum computing, computation, physics, and consciousness. And today I'll be discussing his one. For one thing, I'll be discussing the insights from one of his books, was published this year, June 12th, 2025, known as Eternal Bharat. I have it right here, Truth, Meaning, and Beauty. And specifically, I want to discuss the insights from this book on that it has on the Upanishads, which is a collection of around 108 books, of which 16 to 18 of them form the core text of the Upanishads, which was seen as one of the pinnacles of Indian creativity, specifically in the areas of self introspection and self realization and self knowledge, for achieving liberation against the typical Vedic ritualism of the Vedas in Indian society. And so, time permitting, which I'm not sure if we will have time to discuss it. I would also like to draw some parallels with Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, of which there are some parallels with the Upanishads, of which we can discuss if there's time permitting. But specifically with Dr. Kak, I would like to gain his insights on his book, Eternal Bharat, and promote it, as well as to discuss its insights into the Upanishads and specifically why the Upanishads is such a critical text for ancient Indian history as well as for posterity. And so to get started, Dr. Kak, I would just like to ask you, what is the historical and spiritual significance of the Upanishads? What is its underlying truth in contrast to the older Vedas?
Okay, well, glad to be on your show, Sunny. This is the second time we are meeting, and we had a great conversation last time. So, the most ancient Sanskrit texts or Indian texts have 5 or 6 layers, and the earliest layer is a collection of hymns in 4 books, and they are the Vedas. After that come the Brahmanas. The Brahmanas are also texts, but they are in prose. The Vedas are hymns. So the Brahmanas are in prose and they talk about partly the mystery of reality, but they also talk about some ritual and they explain it, what that ritual is and what the process is. Then come Aranyakas, which are forest books. The word Aranya means forest. So these were the rishis who were in the forest and they wrote these books, and they are like the Brahmanas, like the postscripts to the Brahmanas. And then come the Upanishads. The word Upanishad really means the same as understanding in English. In fact, what does the word understanding mean? I was, I understood it perfectly. I was a few years ago, I was at Coimbra University in Portugal, visiting one of their old lecture halls. Coimbra is probably the oldest European university. It goes back perhaps 1,000 years. And I discovered that the teacher would appear uh, at the second level out of a doorway or a window, and all the students would be standing at the ground level. So understanding comes from that. Understand. So if you're a teacher talking to you and you're down, that's understanding. The word Upanishad, up means next, ni means near, and shad means sit. Next, near, sit. So the guru or the teacher sat typically under a tree on a platform, and his students sat next to the platform on the ground. And so it's really identical to the image to that of understanding, right? Excepting that it is under sitting. So Upanishad really means under sitting. Okay, so what do they talk about? The Vedas talk about the mystery of reality. Now, why is there a mystery? Because there are two aspects to reality. One is, of course, the physical aspect. You go out, you have houses, you have rivers, you have mountains, you have things that people own, or horses, or cars, right? And then you have your own body. And inside the house, there are other bodies, humans, and you relate to them. But the mystery comes from the very power that each of us has of the very fact of understanding. If you are machines, if you are objects, if you have physical systems, where does understanding arise from? Because clearly you could have other kinds of physical systems, such as robots, and you could have many robots in a house. They won't, I presume, if one were to use logic, they won't be able to understand what's really going on. They would be able to store information, perhaps, store images, right, as they can. They could have cameras, but they would not have consciousness. They would be bereft of consciousness. So it's consciousness which is the mystery, the real mystery. And that's what the Vedas are all about. And the Vedas proclaim all the time that really we are about consciousness. And they say there are two aspects to reality. The physical reality is governed by laws, and what are these laws? Like gravitation is a law, or electricity and magnetism are described by laws. And there are also other natural processes, like the sun rising every day. So it happens day after day, right? These are natural laws, or physical, biological laws, or biological beings, organisms are born and then they die, right? So that's a law. Life is a certain window. So the hymns speak of them, but they say that, look, consciousness is not something that can be described by language, because consciousness is the capacity for you to perceive. And that capacity is not a thing. You can describe by language only other things or relationship between things, right? For example, history is abstractions obtained from the study of events, right? So it's something that can be studied. You can use language. Geography, you can use language. Sociology or physics or biology, they can all be described within certain formal systems, watertight, airtight or not. History, for example, is sort of open-ended. We have past. We don't know how the societies will evolve in the future, but you can talk about the past in a logical way. So what the rishis said was that uh, consciousness can only be experienced. It cannot be discussed. It cannot be talked about because it's not a thing. This is the ultimate mystery. And then there are also in the hymns there are speculations of various kinds, or there are certain historical events which have been generalized, because from events also you can draw large conclusions. So the hymns speak of all of that. Now, the Upanishads were books in prose, in very simple prose, to talk about all of these things. So really, if you want to understand the Vedas, you must understand the Upanishads, because Upanishads ask the most basic questions. Why is this, or why is that, or how does one know, or one of the Upanishads says, what happens when one dies? Kathopanishad, for example. Or there's a Upanishad even on birth, which is called Garbha Upanishad. Garbha meaning womb. So how is the conception of the baby, of course, has a physical element, the sperm and the egg coming together, but how does this embryo come to have its own consciousness. So that's what Garbha Upanishads addresses. So the Upanishads then are prose commentaries or texts, often in the form of a dialogue between a teacher and a student. And as you said, there are more than 100, but 18 of them are considered principal Upanishads. And I have some of the Upanishads as well as their translations in this book, Eternal Bharat. Now, after the Upanishads came other layers of literature, and they include sutras. Sutras is the next layer where you use very simple. The word sutra means thread. The word sutra is the same as the word suture in Latin or English, right? Thread, suture. You suture up a wound. So these are threads of thought. For example, there is sutras related to yoga, yoga sutras, so which tell you what yoga is all about. Or there are Vaisheshika, which is about physics, or Nyaya, which is about logic. And so there's 6 big sutras, and there are many others. And there are sutras in the Buddhist tradition as well, or in the Jain tradition as well. And then you also have Shastras. Shastras are scientific texts. And then these scientific texts also include Ayurveda, and they also include, say, Jyotish, meaning astronomy. And then a whole series of other texts, Niti texts, which are about ethics, about morality. So literally any subject that you can think of is a part of this literature. And it's really the most enormous literature that humanity possesses at this time, and only a fraction of it has been translated into English and other languages.
Wow, that's pretty amazing that you're saying only a fraction of this has been translated, um, of this ancient text. Um, so I do have a couple questions that is consciousness well actually before I ask that question, I would want to ask specifically about the first sentence in the introduction of your book. Could you elaborate on what you mean by this? Bharat may be seen through various lenses, and perhaps the most revealing is yoga, which is Sanatan Dharma in practice. Could you elaborate a little
Okay,
bit about that?
sure. Now, the word Bharat itself, the name for India in Sanskrit is Bharat. The word Bha means light, and Rat means absorbed. People who are absorbed in wisdom. That is the land Bharat. Now, it's also called, the title of the book is Eternal Bharat. So, what the Vedas are all about are eternal truths. Another definition of the Veda is eternal truth. And eternal truth will be the same everywhere, whether you're in India or China, the US, or wherever. And they will be universal. So the Vedas are about universal truth. They're not about, random assertions by somebody that live life this way or that way. There could be those things as well, which are a part of social norms or customs. But they are not eternal truths because one could live according to different kinds of customs. So Bharat then is about, and the Bharatiya wisdom or Indian wisdom is about verities, which means truths, which apply to everybody for all times. Now, what the Vedic texts say is that there are 2 kinds of knowledge. One is called Shruti, and the word Shruti means heard, and the other is called Smriti, and Smriti means remembered. Now, Vedas are Shruti. Now, what does that really mean? Shruti, we have 5. We have 5 elements, as we know in common parlance, which are earth, water, fire, air, and space. But in Sanskrit, it's really Akasha. And beyond that is consciousness. So Akasha, which is sometimes translated as space or sky, is where you are most directly in contact with this light, because consciousness is that light. You see that? So whatever comes to you, the eternal truths apprehended most directly by your mind, those are universal laws. Now, once you go down further, after hearing uh, comes images, right? Light. Let's go back through the sequence. You have earth, earth, water, fire, air, and akash. So this light comes through akash to us. So air is where the hearing is, right? Vibrations. So it comes into us through hearing. That's why the deepest wisdom is called Shruti, it's heard. Now, below that is light and physical light, which is where images are formed or what we see, forms. And that is Smriti, that is a part of custom. Now, the Vedas say that your custom can change. See, for example, um, you could be based on where you live or your family, you could be a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian, or you could eat one way or the other, or you eat sitting on the floor or at a table, whatever customs may be. So they vary according to age and time. But Shruti is eternal. So the Vedas are about eternal verities, but they also touch upon Smriti to the extent that the rishis that spoke about it were a part of a historical moment. And so they were talking about it within the context of the customs that were prevalent at that time.
Okay. So speaking of the eternal, I would like to fuse two of my questions together. Can you explain why enigma and paradox is used and why the Upanishads teach through the device of enigma and paradox, and specifically why they use this to emphasize the self? And what is the self? Why is the self incomprehensible, undecaying, unattached? What does this mean? These terms they use to describe the, I mean, I guess it's the Atman, but the self. But why do they use that terminology? And why do they use enigma and paradox as the devices to explain it?
Okay, because every human being or every living being uh, comes in kind of a paradox, and I'll tell you what. Okay, we are our bodies for sure, right? Eyes and nose and this and that. So we are the body, we walk around from one place to another. But how we apprehend reality is not through the body. Now, of course, in Western psychology, they would say it's the eye that sees. But in reality, the eye does not see. Eye is only an instrument. It's your consciousness, the Atman within the mind, illuminated by consciousness, which sees. So then the question arises, who are you? Are you your body or are you your mind? See, there is always this division sometimes, and we are torn between the two. For example, sometimes you say, well, I don't like the way I look. So at that time, you're negating yourself, right? Or you want to be somebody, you want to look somewhat different. Or you want to say, one of the deepest things of the Vedic understanding, wisdom, is that there is only one Atman. There's only one light. And this is the most subtle and beautiful aspects of Vedic wisdom. There's only one light. There's only one consciousness. Just as you might say, there's only one gravitational field or gravitational force. Now, different objects can have gravitation, but the force is only one. So consciousness as a force is only one. Now, we, in some sense, know it. Each one of us knows it. And that's why when people fall in love, for example, let's say a boy and a girl, uh, they know that because their consciousness is one, but there are two bodies. So there is that, you see that? And it's that tension where you are and you are not. You are this body and you're not this body at the same time. You are in this moment and you're not in this moment because the past is all gone. And this moment itself is transitioning so rapidly to the next moment, right? So who are we? What is time? Time is also one of the deepest mysteries there is. So this all ultimately can be uh, sort of uh, you can wrap yourself around it using paradox, that you are this and you're not this. You yeah, okay, let me give you another example. You love somebody very much, you want to possess that person, but if you really truly love somebody, you also want to let go, you also want that person to have freedom. Do you see that? It's both, and it's this opposition that is then captured in deep psychology or in the Upanishads in terms of paradox, paroksha. And in fact, one of the most subtle Upanishads, it's called Isha, yeah, Isha Upanishad. It even says, paroksha priya ivhi devaha, that the devas, your senses, love what is paroksha. Paroksha means paradoxical. Pratyaksha means which is obvious. Paroksha means which is not what it appears to be, which is what a paradox is, right? And so ultimately, and I think here one can set up this opposition from modes of knowing. Western modes, which are at a certain level, at a certain level, objects are things, and you should describe them as such. And especially inanimate objects are only things. But when it comes to uh, living objects are changing all the time. They have autonomy, they have agency. Then you have paradox. And so what the Vedas discuss and what the Upanishads also do is to speak not only of inanimate objects and things, but also of living objects. And we, as human beings, are examples of that. So they really address the most fundamental questions of being. Who am I? Because if you could describe yourself, then you would know yourself. And once you know yourself, perhaps you won't feel so bad. Because why do people feel bad? Because they don't know what they are. They're tossed around by events, right? Most people are tossed around by sequence of events which are greater than them, right? For example, they are raised in a particular way, there are certain expectations their family has or their social group has. So they're forced, they're doing one thing after another, and really they have no freedom. And the same thing happens even at a national level or a societal level. So what the Vedas is saying is that you obtain freedom if you become one with this Atman within you. Because you're not one. You have obscured that light within yourself and you are governed by autonomic behavior associated, right? So you do things because they are expected of you. So we are really like AI machines in a certain sense.
Wow. So yeah, just to delve a little more into some aspects of your book. I'm interested in a number of things you said, especially considering the Atman. And so another question I have is that what are the three-part reality? What is the three-part reality of Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess represent, and why is it important? And also specifically Shiva and Prajna. Could you emphasis on that? Could you explain the three-part reality of Shiva, Vishnu, and the goddess, and specifically Shiva? Why is Shiva's relationship to dreaming and creativity so important to specific fields such as scientists, musicians, artists? How does that embody the reality of Shiva and creativity?
Okay, now what is reality? One might ask, right? What is reality? If you step out of your house, you see the cosmos, you see the sky and the stars, especially at night, stars billions of miles into the space, right? So, and then during the day, you have the sun. At night, if it's not a dark night, you have the moon, right? So, and then you have the various planets. So that is the physical cosmos, right? Okay, so you have the physical cosmos. Now, the physical cosmos uh, is that mystery of the physical cosmos is expressed in terms of Vishnu. The word Vish means pervader. So Vishnu is the logic which holds the physical cosmos together, right? So Vishnu is everywhere. So that's Vishnu. So we have to acknowledge the physical universe. You can't just live in a solipsistic state and say, well, all that there is the earth, which is not the case. You have the whole cosmos. Okay. But how do we see this physical cosmos? We don't actually go to the sun or the moon or the stars. We see them in our mind, in our imagination, in our consciousness, right? So this whole cosmos, outer cosmos, is mirrored in our consciousness, right? And the word for consciousness here, as a universal principle, because there are two aspects to consciousness. One is universal consciousness, the other is individual consciousness. This individual consciousness can vary. If you're very sleepy and groggy, you don't see things as well as when you are clear-minded. So this principle, which gives you the capacity to uh, see the universe, which is Shiva. And the word Shiva means auspicious, because it makes the whole universe auspicious, because otherwise it's very terrifying. You might say, and some people get that situation feeling, hey, I'm all alone in this cosmos. I'm a piece of dust on another piece of dust. Earth itself is like a piece of dust in the whole cosmos, right? So what is the meaning of my life? A person can go crazy, and some people do. So, no, there is an amazing power, which is the power of Shiva within you, because this power gives you the capacity to comprehend the whole cosmos. Okay, now that is consciousness. But where does this consciousness reside? It resides within us, right? Where? We don't know. Even science doesn't know. Seems to be spread everywhere. The neuroscientists have not been able to locate any specific place in the brain where consciousness resides. It seems to be everywhere. Okay, so it resides within the body, and body is nature. Body represents the goddess. Nature, which unfolds, is the goddess, right? And we are a part of that nature. And therefore, the Vedas also say that one way to understand reality is to worship the goddess. Worshipping the goddess means to understand this whole process of transformation that can occur within you. That is what goddess means. Now, you can do it in different ways. One is, of course, you can do it through science, like physiology or psychology or even history and sociology. Tell you something about the nature of the mind, right? Why do kingdoms fall, or why does the human mind work in a particular way? Seeing it through the lens of history also provides you some knowledge about yourself. But more directly, you can close your eyes and ask yourself, hey, where am I actually observing everything? Am I observing it in the head? But the rest of the body is also mirrored in the head. You have motor cortex, and the entire body is mirrored in the head. So you can try to open up doorways to the inner hall of mirrors where perception takes place. And that's what's called yoga or tantra. And that could also be called the worship of the goddess. because goddess is embodied reality. Okay. Um, the other question was, yeah, the other question is, how do we obtain knowledge, which is of course very important. Okay, people have done research on it, psychologists and others, and they've discovered that when you are creative, you're not thinking consciously. The creative impulse manifests itself spontaneously. Sometimes it shows up in your dreaming or you're dozing off. Generally dreaming. I can tell you about myself. A lot of my research, the most important research, the results came sort of spontaneously. So one of the Upanishads, it's called the Mundak Upanishad, says that there are four states of awareness. The waking. In the waking state, everything is fixed. You have houses, you have your own body, you have the bodies of other people around you, your relatives, friends, family. So within this framework, nothing new can arise. So creativity cannot occur in the waking state. Creativity occurs in the dreaming state, because in the dreaming state, they uh, they the way your thoughts are um, controlled by the images that you relate yourself with is suspended. In your dreaming state, you can even be flying, or you could be, jumping off cliffs or this or that. So how does that happen? That's when consciousness is speaking to you in a kind of a coded language. Okay. And that's when consciousness, because we've already agreed, and my scientific paper also proves it, we have agreed that consciousness is transcendent, it's not material. Okay. If it's transcendent, it's present everywhere, all the time. And it informs our mind, this consciousness, when we are not uh, constrained by our waking experience. So when we are not, or we are suspended that consciousness or the goddess or your deity is speaking to you and telling you what's to be done.
Interesting. So Shiva in many ways is kind of this um creative function, correct? Um
Shiva is the consciousness itself, and in
Conscious.
fact, even the Bhagavad Gita, the great texts of Hinduism, which is a summary of all the Upanishads. That's what the Bhagavad Gita itself claims. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, I am present in everybody's heart as Maheshwara. Maheshwara means Shiva. So it's just, ultimately, you could also say that Shiva and Vishnu are the same. And that form is called Harihara. So we are imposing language on something which is beyond language, right? And that's why all these things become a possibility. Harihara. Hara means Shiv, Vishnu as one being. Or you could speak about Ardhanarishwara, which means half woman, Ishvara, half woman, Shiva, half woman meaning the goddess, where the goddess and Shiva are half and half. Because Shiva cannot be without the goddess. Consciousness cannot be without the body.
The body.
So you can also conceive of it in that particular fashion.
Okay. So speaking of consciousness, um, this is a much more generalized question, but is consciousness seen as the frontier of science in the modern era? And was it also the frontier of science in the ancient times as well? Was there a gap between the ancient sages of India? I don't know if it was studied elsewhere around the world. But was there a gap in focusing on consciousness during the ancient times between today to where there is kind of this reinvigoration in which people like yourself are studying consciousness? Is this a new phenomenon that consciousness is now the frontier of scientific inquiry?
Consciousness is at this point the frontier of scientific inquiry. Why? Because people are trying to build conscious machines. So they have to understand where consciousness comes in from. Conscious computers, for example, right? Or from the perspective of physics, where is the observer? Or from the perspective of neuroscience, where is consciousness inside the brain? So it is the frontier right now. It was the real deep science in India because the Vedic rishis mentioned that this is Atma Vidya. The Vedas are Atma Vidya, Vidya of Atman, right? Vidyas of the Vidya of consciousness. So in India, so this is a very interesting history of science, history of ideas question. How come India was so far advanced? It really was, because India was the only civilization where there was a systematic study of consciousness. There could have been mystics in other civilizations, right? There were mystics in medieval Europe or shamans and so on, but that was more in terms of a performance. A shaman comes in and he does a dance and gives some comfort to somebody. No systematic study. So yes, the Vedas are the only unbroken systematic study, and it's extremely ancient. We don't know how ancient the Vedas are because there are astronomical references there which go to the fourth millennium BCE, which is 6,000 years. So, as far as back in Indian history, clearly there were these rishis. So, this is a part of the tradition that India has been. And clearly, even when I was growing up, for example, in Kashmir, these ideas of what is the mystery were a part of the conversation that the adults had. And we sort of through osmosis absorbed a part of it. And I think it's quite unique all over India, not just Kashmir. I'm sure if you went to South India, Middle India, East India, West India, wherever, uh, unlike dogmatic religions, where, and there are other religions which are dogmatic, where you're told this is right, this is wrong, believe this, and if you don't believe in this, you're going to go to hell or you will be killed. There's no such thing in Hinduism. Hinduism is the path of inquiry, self-inquiry, and you are encouraged to ask whatever questions you can think of. Because in order to sharpen your buddhi or intellect, you have to ask questions. You know, without asking, you won't understand that aspect of your own mind. So that's what it was. All questions were welcome. And the Upanishads also, encourage questions. The guru, the teacher, encourages questions from the student. And all kinds of, subtle questions are a part of that. So to come back, incredible. The whole thing, it seems unbelievable that here we are in the 21st century and the Vedas appear as central to human inquiry in the 21st century, as they were, say, the 18th century when the German idealists like Schopenhauer or Immanuel Kant looked at it, or during the Middle Ages when people were studying the Bhagavad Gita, or 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago in India. It's amazing. Why? Because there are two aspects to reality, the physical and consciousness. And this is the science of consciousness. The science of consciousness is about experience and it doesn't change.
Interesting. Um, so there was a question I had asked you in our first podcast that it's a this is also a very generalized question. What is well, it's in the Upanishads. What is the relation of Atman to Brahman, and why is it the basis intuitively for morality and compassion in the in the Indian system of philosophy. Um, and second to that, why is the principle of change or transformation, as represented by, I believe, the goddess, so central to the Upanishads?
Okay, the first question, the relationship between the Atman and Brahman, right? Brahman is the conception of the Atman at the cosmos level, the whole cosmos. That is Brahman. All of reality is in the sea of consciousness. So you can call that Brahman. But that's just a conception in our mind. But you don't necessarily have to distinguish between the two. In fact, one aspect or one form of Advaita Vedanta is called Kashmir Shaivism.
Mhm.
And in Kashmir Shaivism, the very first sutra of the Shiva Sutra is I am, no, uh, Chaitanyam Atma. The Chaitanya, awareness itself is Atman. And that's where Shiva is. Awareness, that power that you have, that is where Shiva is. So you don't have to look for it anywhere. You see that? Beautiful, very beautiful. In the Vedas, also in the Upanishads, you also have statements such as "I am Atma Brahma." That this Atman itself is Brahman. So goes back there as well. Now, how is it a source of morality? If uh, if you were to believe that another person is inferior to you in some sense, then you might want, for the sake of symmetry, want to get rid of that person, right? There's something wrong with this person, right? Or here is this animal who's inferior to you, so you would have no compunction in stomping on it and killing it, right? If you think it would hurt you, you would do that. The idea of Atman, that this same Atman is within you and me and the monkey or some other creature, leads to compassion that, look, the monkey is really the same as you. Of course, its brain is not identical to yours and it's operating within its own ecosystem, but you can be compassionate. You can. Now, that doesn't mean that this says that everybody has to be a vegetarian. It doesn't say that because it also recognizes that this whole world is a uh, is a if you can imagine yourself in the sea and you have big fish and small fish. The big fish to survive must eat the small fish. We are all part of the food chain. To that extent, for example, in Kashmir or Ladakh. In Ladakh, there's no food 20 or minus 30 degrees. So people eat meat. There's no other. In Kashmir also, everybody ate meat because that was the only way to survive. So it's perfectly legitimate to eat meat as well. But you have to minimize needless killing. That is what this tells you. That is the morality. Be compassionate to everybody, to all beings, but don't kill for the sake of killing, which some other thought, body centric thoughts might say, oh, kill other bodies because they're not your body, or kill other people, they don't have the same belief like yours. There's no such thing in this. Every human being is worthy and capable of the deepest wisdom, of the deepest wisdom. So we are all the same. We're all the same.
Interesting. So, I'm just looking at one of my questions. When there's this quote you made in in your book, which is when the conditioning associated with the mind is removed, that is, the lens is removed, the jiva consciousness becomes one with the Atman. And you say this happens through bhakti yoga, through one cleanses the mind through bhakti yoga, transcending the intellect through jnana yoga, or overcoming the ego through karma yoga. Um, could you? I don't know if you remember that that sentence in your book, but could you
No,
explain
no,
what?
no, I understand. Yeah, I get it. See, what I'm saying, generally, you know what the problem is, even for creativity. The problem is the ego. You know, creativity comes from within, from some space from within which nobody knows. In fact, there's a very famous statement attributed to Einstein. He says, "My pencil is smarter than I." And what he really meant was, you know, when he gets going, he doesn't know where the result's coming from, right? Because you can't impose your ego. The moment you think you are doing it, your ahankar, your ego, you will not get it because then you're stuck, right? So, the biggest unlearning that anybody has to do in life for creativity, for success, for everything else is to get rid of their ego. In fact, people who have huge ego can only go to a certain point. They can probably be bouncers in a club, but not to deride bouncers, they do a very important function as well. But you have to let go of your ego. So now, how do you let go of your ego? Either through devotion, you know, through true devotion. You go to your deity and you really say, okay, I love you, or whatever, right? Whichsoever way you relate to your deity, or you surrender. That process of surrender itself is to let go of your ego. Or you say, I am going to just study as dispassionately as I can, and that's jnana yoga or jnana yoga, which is when you realize, first of all, that everybody else is also like you. You know that the process of knowledge is universal, right? And you can relate to anyone. It doesn't really matter who did it, whether it was a Chinese or an American or a African or an Indian. Knowledge is universal, and that lets you, get away from your ego. And the third is karma yoga, service. You are serving others. The very process of serving others arises from compassion. You know, you're a doctor, or even if you're a waiter in a restaurant, and you do it with full heart, right? You want to be as nice to everybody who's coming in. And that also fills you up with with joy of a certain kind and wisdom in its own way, although you may not be able to articulate it.
So specifically the karma yoga, I think different practitioners have their own ways towards moksha or liberation. But karma yoga, some people say, I believe because it is, I mean, service or selfless service, I think it's one of the higher types of yoga. And specifically, many people, I think Swami Vivekananda said the Buddha was one of the highest karma yogis. So is there, I'm wondering what is the parallel, but is there any parallel that you know of between because the Upanishads are being formed, some say 700 BC to 300 BC. They're different estimates by different people. But around that time period also was when the Buddha and Mahavira were also in the beginning of that time period, they were also coming up. So are there any parallels between Buddhism, Jainism with the Upanishads? And do you see parallels?
Well, to the extent one speaks of compassion, the moment you speak of compassion, and of course, the Buddha focused on compassion because he talked about dukkha or suffering. So, how do you reduce suffering, right? So, his focus was suffering. The focus in the Upanishads is that of knowledge, right? But then these are two aspects of the same thing because lack of knowledge leads to suffering, right? So, suffering is focusing on a certain aspect of it, and knowledge is focusing on another aspect of it. Knowledge is the positive side, suffering is the negative side. Because if you don't have knowledge, you suffer. You are in pain, psychological or otherwise. So now, did this have anything to do with the rise of Jainism and Buddhism? Well, first of all, the Jainis claim that they were Tirthankars before Mahavir. Mahavir came late in the line. The second thing is that the Upanishads really don't say anything beyond what is already in the Vedas. they are just a nice capsule form of that Vedic wisdom. So I don't think, some people may have speculated on this, but personally, I don't think uh, there is a genitive relationship between the two, because the Upanishads, um, even Isha Upanishad, that is the very last section of Yajurveda, Isha Upanishad, and uh, so I think the very heart of the Vedas, as I said, I am Atma Brahma. This Atman is the cosmos, it's the whole universe. And if this Atman and your same, that ergo, you, we are the same. We should be compassionate to each other. If we are not exactly at the same space because we were born differently and maybe, so I have insights which you may not possess, but that doesn't mean that there's any difference, because you would also maybe even faster. And all of that emerges from the fundamentals of the Vedas.
So another concept I'm curious about is there's this notion of a return to Vedanta. And I think some people believe that the Vedanta was synonymous with the Upanishads because it was seen as the pinnacle of one of the pinnacles of Indian creativity. But I was unaware that of what you said, that the Upanishads is really just a reflection of the Vedas, just in a more nuanced fashion, would you say? Or is a return to Vedanta what the Bhagavad Gita talks about? Do you have any insight into what this return, or maybe a return to Vedanta also could be consciousness as the new scientific frontier potentially? Um, I don't know. Do you have any insights into what that could mean?
Yes, yes. Well, the mystery of reality is seen through six different lenses. The darshanas. Darshan means to see. Okay, and the darshanas are mimamsa, which is your ritual, normal things you do. You want to get understanding through that, or through logic, which is nyaya, or vaisheshika, to understand the logic of things, or yoga, or Sankhya. Sankhya is the counting of different categories, right? 25 in Sankhya and 11 in Kashmir Shaivism, a total of 36. Or Vedanta. Vedanta is one of those six. Vedanta is asking the deepest questions about consciousness itself. It's not about things now, about consciousness, because ultimately, in our heart, when we close our eyes, we are consciousness. When you're not standing up and feeling around and looking around, then we are also bodies, right? But ultimately, when you have closed your eyes, we are really just consciousness. Now, all of these things were a part of the Vedas. They are in the Vedas. There are Mahavakyas and so on. Now, they return to Vedanta. Now, of course, Vedanta itself, as a formal discipline, is seen through the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, and the Bhagavad Gita. Normally, these are the three sets of documents, because the darshanas became maybe formal later on in the centuries BCE. But return to Vedanta now, if one were to use it, would be to say, okay, there were certain customs or ritual or this or that, and they were historically grounded. But now let's go to the big daddy problem, the biggest daddy problem, which is, what is reality? Who am I? And that is Vedanta, right? So to that extent, yes, what is happening across the world is yoga. People do yoga, but yoga is just a doorway, a segue, so to speak, to pull you in. You are focusing on your body, but to focus on your body is to make you think about what your body is, because once you think of that, then the next question comes, hey, who is it who is in the body? So once you have done your yoga, it's much easier to get into Vedanta. The physical yoga, the asanas. then you can go and do the Vedanta, which is the ultimate thing. And once you do the Vedanta, it also transforms you. Yoga also transforms you physically, you become more fit. But once you do Vedanta, it completely changes you. It liberates. It's for liberation. Liberating meaning you become free of the karmic chain into which you've been projected by your family, your society, your temperament. And you want to be free where you have total agency, where creative thoughts come to you. And that for that you need Vedanta.
Hmm. So I'm also curious concerning back to Buddhism. Do you think the Buddha got something fundamentally wrong about the self or the soul? Because if you read about the Buddha, it says that he denied that there was any soul until the end of his life, to where he pronounced that there was some sort of Atman. Um, because I think the reason they said he did that was because he didn't want people to get attached to anything or something. I don't know the full story, the full story, but do you think Buddhism gets something fundamentally wrong that the Upanishads is correct about concerning the Atman and its relationship?
Uh, I think you summarized it well, because during his life, he won't answer the question if there's an Atman, but on his deathbed, yes. And initially, in the Hinayan, the lesser tradition, there was a mention of it, but ultimately, when Nagarjuna arose, he attached himself to a literal meaning of shunyata. Because in the Upanishads, you have both the statement neti neti, na iti, meaning not this, not this, neti neti,
Mhm.
which takes you to the idea of there's nothing. Or in the Upanishads, you also have aham brahmasmi, I am the entire Brahman, right? You have both of them. So these are like saying glass is half full or glass is half empty. Now, the Buddha himself wanted people to become strengthened, because you don't want, one of the problems that can arise if you uh, give a student or a person too much of positive ideas, they might really think they're smarter than what they really are. You have to go through suffering in order to really get understanding, right? So I think that's what he did. He told people, there is nothing, discover yourself, this or that, right? Or have compassion, reduce your suffering. But later on, in academic Buddhism, especially now in Western Buddhism, and many followers of Nagarjuna, and they were quite influential, including in Kashmir, they focused on the transitoriness of things, the transient aspect of reality. And but then changes, our mind changes, everything is transient. Then how do you know that you are the same person that you were when you were a 5-year-old or a 2-year-old? And so the objection from Vedanta or Kashmir Shaivism was that, look, things are changing, your body is changing, but there is something which never changes, which is Shiva, which is that light. And it's because of that unchanging nature of that light, or Brahman, or whatever you want to call, or you might even want to call Krishna. These words, because of that unchanging nature, that you can relate to those aspects of you when you were young, when your body was not the same as what it is now.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that principle of change is very central to a lot of I mean, it's central to many of the Indian philosophy. Um, and I think it's true in philosophies around the world as well. Um, I also want to ask about the influence of Panini, because I know you write about him in many of your books. Um, and I want to ask, I think it was written in your book, why was Panini's work so invaluable to fixing the chronology of the texts of the Vedic period? And why is he considered one of the progenitors of computer science?
Okay, Panini,
I pronounced his name
he
right.
lived in Northwest India, not yeah, Panini,
Oh,
not very far from the Kashmir Valley, in where would be near right now. So what he did was he cast all of Sanskrit grammar into 4,000 algebraic rules, right? Something that has never been equal for any language by any scholar in the past 2,500 years. Now we know when he lived, for there are lots of historical cues also. While he's talking of these rules, he's also using, some relevant contemporary cues. So we know he lived about 500 BCE. Now, the language before Panini had rules which did not always follow what he put in his grammar. Now, his grammar became so prestigious that after him, Sanskrit was written according to the rules that he had enunciated, right? So it gives you a kind of a terminus, that this is prior and this is subsequent. Even the Bhagavad Gita has certain usages which are not according to Panini. So we know that the core of Bhagavad Gita must be before 500 BCE, and certainly the Vedas are prior to that. So that's why it's so important. Now, why is he considered father also of computer science in a certain way, or programming? Because he was able to describe the whole language in 4,000 rules and meta rules. Meta rules meaning rules about rules. And that's how programming languages are written. There are rules, and there are also how these rules are to be used. So he did this, of course, in a fashion which is so mysterious right now. How did he do it? Why did he do it? So far in the remote past. And why is it that nobody has been able to equal it until that time, right? Now, what happened was when the Europeans discovered Panini, this is about 200 years ago, they were so impressed. There was a French scholar, I think de Saussure, that he said, well, if language can have rules and language uh, is a human activity, we produce language. Other human activities are, say, relationships, sociology. Social relationships are also an expression of human human relationship, right? So they said, well, we should have similar rules for anthropology, for sociology, and other subjects. So all of the social sciences, in a fashion, are or owe their beginnings to Panini's Ashtadhyayi. Ashtadhyayi meaning 8 chapters. It was in 8 chapters.
interesting.
And since both of us are Kashmiris, a Kashmiri connection, uh, one great commentary on Panini was written by Patanjali, and it's called Mahabhashya, the great commentary. And it was the value of that great commentary, Mahabhashya, which really made Panini conquer all of India because it was so prestigious. So Patanjali, the author of Mahabhashya, was from Kashmir.
Hmm. Okay, wow. So going back to um so in your book you also talk about the churning of the ocean um and the struggle between the asuras and the devas. Um could you describe the deeper meaning of this allegory?
Sure. See, we initially we talked about paradox related to us, right? Body consciousness. That's paradox. The other side of this paradox is domination versus um, versus comprehension. The asura side of each one of us. Within each one of us is an asuric side and a daivic side. The asuric side is about domination, about materiality, about bodies. Because as a body, you want to dominate other bodies. As a body, we're also bodies. We want to have toys. Why does a child want a toy? Because then the child can possess that toy, right? Why does a young man want a Lamborghini? Because then he can possess that, he can show it off, right? But within us is also freedom as encapsulated in our daivic form, because the senses are only instruments. They take us ultimately to consciousness. Now, in a certain sense, this was also uh, understood, perhaps not this directly, in, say, in Rome, where you talk about two aspects. One is the sinister, the other is the dexter. Sinister is left-handed, which is material, which is domination, and dexter is more even, which is more wise, right? So the Daivic doesn't say that the body doesn't exist, but it sort of integrates everything together. In fact, we can also take this to current political scene. You have left parties, and then you have more well-formulated, more, let's say, parties led by wiser people. Left parties only want domination, right? The history of the past, ever since communism triumphed in Russia, was about domination, where your thoughts also need to be controlled. That is left. Right says, no, let you have whatever thoughts, let you integrate, let each person sort it out. So this struggle between the asuras and the devas also occurs within each person. And it's through that struggle that you are given gifts, the gifts which give you creative gifts, for example, that churning, you need that churning within you, because unless you do the churning, you will not know who you are. So this allegory occurs at so many different levels.
Wow. Interesting. Um, so seeing the trend of Hindu texts, I'm trying to think of a question. So would you say as I've said this before, but would you say the Upanishads, it's a continuation of the Vedas, but some people say it was the pinnacle of Indian intellectual creativity? Or would that be correct to say? Or because the Bhagavad Gita, you said in some sense is a summary of what was written in the Upanishads. Um, but you also said that much of our Indian text has not been translated as well.
The main text, there are so many commentaries. When we say that a lot has not been translated, those are subsidiary texts or later on medieval texts and others. The main ones, when you go to the period, the main texts are translated. And Upanishads are the pinnacle to the extent that there everything is clearly enunciated. And because at the pinnacle of a mountain, things are clear. While you're climbing the pinnacle, you're going through woods and so on, you can't see the sky very clearly, or you can't see the whole landscape very clearly. Now, in the Upanishads, these rishis put everything out in as much of clarity as is possible. So you're really sitting on the top of the mountain. And that's why the Bhagavad Gita is also seen as the summary of all the Upanishads. And as we mentioned it already, for example, you have the image in the Bhagavad Gita of the individual where the senses are the horses, the intellect is the reins, and the mind is the driver, right? And next to the mind driver is the Atman. And you have this image actually from the Kathopanishad. In Kathopanishad, you already have this image. So you do have this, and all of this is beautiful. In fact, all I can say is the Vedas, the yoga books, and everything else have such extraordinary wisdom that it's all one can say is absolutely incredible. But they've also been misunderstood and misrepresented hugely in school textbooks. The guys who write these books just don't get it. Most of these books, they don't get it at all, which is very sad. So a lot of people are misinformed about all of this. And partly the reason is it's so many layers of literature, right? You can pull one thing here, get one thing from here, and make up something and say, hey, this is what the Vedas are. But that's not what it is. You really have to go back to the Vedas, to the Upanishads, and then, see them for what they are. See them directly, see them yourself. And see, for example, one misunderstanding which you see repeated often in American universities is that the Purusha Sukta, 1090, I believe, which says originally there was Purush, and from the head the Brahmins were born, the arms the Rajanyas or the Kshatriyas were born, from the thighs the Vaishyas, from the feet the Shudras, right? So then immediately the sociologists, anthropologists say that this means that this whole system is hierarchical. But people make such elementary mistakes. Every human being has the same Purush. All the Vedic texts say it again and again, the same Atman. If every human being has the same Atman, every human being has the Brahman, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra within them. Every human being. And we do different roles. Role as when you're thinking about the mystery, only then you're a Brahman. If you're thinking of protecting your family or doing what you have to do as a karma yogi, then you are a Kshatriya or a Rajanya, right? And so a lot of people don't get it. A lot of professors don't get it. But now I'm not that surprised. Why? Because while it's true that some of the smartest people are in the academy, are professors, some of the most stupid people are also in the academy. All times. And so it becomes a kind of a challenge sometimes to avoid the stupid ones and be attached only to the good ones.
Okay. So I know I discussed this with you in the last podcast, what you mentioned that it's important that Indians kind of grab their own agency and start re-looking at their history and like their philosophical history. Um, but I definitely wanted to ask you this question, which I just noticed, because your book, Eternal Bharat, Truth, Meaning, and Beauty, which is your most latest book published this year, you talk a lot about the artistic tradition of India. Specifically, you stress the transformative power of creative art. And you also say music is a medium to reach or hear the divine. So what do you mean by that? What do you mean that the architecture and dance and music in India is a transformative power, and that music specifically or other art forms are there to reach the divine. Um,
Um, what I mean is, as I mentioned earlier, the five elements, right? And you have earth, which is smell, water, which is taste, fire, which is form, uh, air, which is hearing, and then Akash, right? Akash is closest to consciousness. Of course, consciousness pervades everything. So music is closest because the rest of the art forms, the human mind projects a certain structure on them. For example, if you're a painter, then the outer shapes that you see um, do get expressed, or at least they create a kind of a grammar which you have to follow, right? Unless it's very abstract art. So to that extent, music is closest to the consciousness. That's why music can evoke mood much more powerfully and directly than other art forms, right? So can dance, but the problem or painting. But the problem there is that if you see a painting again and again, or a dance again and again, then its power to change you or engage you will become lesser and lesser, right? While music, the possibilities are endless, right? While in other art forms, there are not that many. How many ways can you dance on the screen? While music, you can do, you have so many, you have these notes, you have combinatoric explosion, you have so many ragas which can evoke different kinds of moods. So art is extremely important, I think, in the whole process of self-discovery. Art, these form as well as poetry or whatever else, or writing. Writing is also an art form, and they have writers have tremendous influence over people, right?
Mhm. So, I only have a couple more questions and then we can close out. So somewhere near the end of your book, you say, unobserved dark matter makes up 95% of the universe. Um, and you say it will require the basis of Sanskrit scientific tradition of observation to understand space and time for future generations. Um, so what do you mean that Sanskrit's observation or theory of observation will help us understand unobserved dark matter? Um,
Oh, I don't remember the exact phrase, but what I am alluding to there is that we have viewed physical reality through a certain lens, right? That you have this physical space and um, atoms, electrons, this or that, right? And various forces. In fact, if one were to change this, because the Sanskrit tradition speaks of three kinds of language. This goes to Bhartrihari. One is Vaikhari, which is distributed, words. The other is Madhyama, which is middle. And above that is Pashyanti, where you have a certain structure. So, 5, 6 years ago, I discovered that if you were to approach physics itself from the perspective of Akasha having a structure, then this mystery of dark matter goes away. And I published many, many papers on this. And I was just alluding to it because the book was not on that. And I've written many peer-reviewed journal articles on this. This is a kind of at least the possibility of a new chapter in physics. And not just physics, I've also used this idea to look at the structure of the genetic code. But you can Google it and you'll find many, many references to that. I'll be happy to send you some additional. But to come back to what you're saying, uh, Sanskrit and the Vedic tradition has so many other gifts that it can give us, but we should be humble enough to receive them. If you are humble enough, that's when these gifts work. If you think, well, okay, does it really matter whether you're doing English or Spanish or Sanskrit? In a certain sense, they don't matter. You can read Don Quixote in Spanish and you'll get much more pleasure, certainly doing so. But the other languages do not have this tradition of the science of consciousness, which is the big daddy of all the sciences. And Sanskrit ultimately is about that. So it has, as I mentioned, Victor Meyer. Uh, oh, I wasn't mentioning it to you. I was talking to somebody else this morning. And I mention that in this book as well, maybe in the introduction, or my other book, The Idea of India. When over 1,000 years, a lot of Sanskrit texts were translated into Chinese, from maybe 100 AD to 1200 AD, or 100 CE to 1200 CE. That was the big thing going on in China at that time. These translators discovered that there were so many abstract concepts in Sanskrit for which there was no Chinese analog. So according to Victor Meyer, who's the professor of Chinese and Chinese history at University of Pennsylvania, 35,000 Sanskrit words were taken into Chinese language. So there are 35,000 words in Chinese of Sanskrit origin because those concepts did not exist in Chinese. So I think the time has come. A lot of the concepts within the Vedic framework, people don't understand them because you can only understand something if you're ready to receive it. If you think you already know it all, if you think your physics and chemistry tells you everything about reality, then you can't understand that because this is not talking about physics and chemistry to reality. These texts talk about the reality of consciousness, within which all physical reality is contained. What you know and what I know and what everybody else knows ultimately exists in their mind, in the consciousness in their mind. So consciousness is primary. Just to make this shift is not an easy matter. To go from outer primality to inner primality is a big jump. But that jump makes it worthwhile. Very, very exciting.
I only have a couple more questions, but I do want to ask, do you think the way that Hindu symbolism or Indian symbolism, such as through the Nataraja, Shiva, or through other symbolism, it's well, I think it's well advanced in comparison to many other cultures, because I don't think many other cultures utilize that sort of symbolism to teach through imagery. Like the Nataraja, for example, it denotes many things, like 10 or 12 different aspects of reality. Um, and I also want to ask, do you believe that is also the case? And also, we talked about this before. What do you think Western civilization still has to give to India? I know democracy came to India. I'm not sure if democracy was always a part of India, but I mean, Greece is seen as the birth of democracy. So, do you think there's something that Western civilization still has to give to India? And do you think there's something that India still has to give to the rest of the world? What do you say?
Well, of course, every culture should learn from every other culture. And there's so much stuff to learn um, for the West and India. India also had democratic states during the time of the Buddhas, which are very well described in Buddhist literature, probably prior to even Greek states, but that doesn't really matter. Now, democracy, modern Indian democracy also has huge flaws. So in my view, the great thing about the West, especially America, is that from time to time, it cleanses itself. For example, everybody might like Donald Trump, but he's had the courage to make some fundamental changes. For example, DEI, he says we shouldn't have quotas. Let everybody be treated fairly, equally, right? Personally, I think that's a good thing because that reinvigorates the society. While India has gotten deeply mired in this quota and reservation system, horribly mired. There was just this report yesterday on Twitter of admissions into the PhD math program at Delhi University, which is one of India's principal universities, where for SC/ST, which is scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, the entrance requirement for interview was zero marks. If for others it was 90 out of 100, for them, I mean, you don't have to do this. This is ridiculous. Indians have lost their mind doing this pandering. So what India can learn from the West is be more pragmatic, be fair, treat everybody equally, no matter where they are from, and help people who do need help, but don't do it through reservation which go from one generation to another. For example, the current Chief Justice of India, Mr. Gavai, his father was a governor of a state, more than one state, but he got his job because of reservation, because of the community that he comes in from. This is ridiculous. This should not be allowed unless India is able to cleanse itself of all such, and this is only one of the many problems with Indian democracy, India will not be able to attain its rightful place at the very pinnacle, because right in the next 30, 40 years, it's going to be a contest between China, US, and India, the three largest economies. But India will stay back at the third place unless they reform themselves. And we don't see any politicians with the courage to do so at this particular point. Sadly, also because we have some very bad politicians who belong to certain dynastic families who owe it to their Western handlers who are pushing this agenda. Give more and more quotas, give more and more reservation, muddying up the waters. Rather than calming the waters, they're muddying up the waters, which is a very dangerous thing that these people are doing.
Hmm. Yeah, I know that I mean specifically I know different states in India they get different amount of money from the central government. And sometimes that's for reservations programs or um and I know that's angered that I mean some people don't think it's fair. So I have one last question. You recommended the book Meditations to me. Um, and I know you've read it, but I'm asking just do you see this is my last question before we go. Do you see some parallels between the Upanishads and ancient Indian philosophy with Marcus Aurelius's Meditations? As I do, because I see some clear parallels with yeah, go ahead.
True wisdom is universal. True wisdom is something that you may not be able to vocalize and say, hey, this is how I see it, but you know it. It's experiential. So people like Marcus Aurelius and many others in the West as well had through the struggles through their lives, had reached a particular point, and also through their temperament, where they were able to communicate deep wisdom. And so ultimately, the lesson is all this. As somebody who's read very deep of Western literature, Russian, German, English, French, I know there were lots of these writers where had great understanding of human psychology and motivation and so on. Because, as I said before, all wisdom is universal, it belongs to everybody. And to that extent, the Vedas and the Upanishads belong to all of mankind, and everybody can benefit from them.
Okay, great. Well, Dr. Kak, thank you for coming on my show for a second time. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And hopefully I can have you on again for another podcast in the future. Your insights are always welcome. I mean, you have so much experience in regards to history revisionism and quantum computing and consciousness. It's always nice to get insight from someone who's kind of walked a similar path that I want to walk on as a student in history. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Sunny. Really enjoyed being on it, and my best wishes and blessings to you.
Thank you.